Okay, today I get a chance to revisit somebody who we talked to a long time ago. Now, this is podcast number 247. We are going to go back into the Wayback Machine, all the way back to September 21st of 2014 for podcast number 47, when we talked to Brian Crabtree. Brian Crabtree is one of the two people behind Monome. People who follow my Instagram or Facebook have seen that I've got monome stuff all over my studio. And it's largely because I really respect the work that they do. It's really fun for me to come back and talk to Brian again because an awful lot has happened since we last talked. So rather than jabbering about it much more, let's talk to Brian and get kicking into it. Hey, Brian, how's it going?
Hey, Darwin. Good to talk to you again.
Yeah, likewise. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule. I know it's busy right now because you've just had a number of things hit the works, right?
Yeah, we're just finishing up what seems to be kind of our third batch of this new object called the Norns. But a lot kind of has happened actually since we spoke last in 2014.
2014, I know. Isn't that something? Seems like it wasn't that long ago, but.
Yeah. So what was the context back then? I think.
I think it was like the beginning of you playing around in the modular world, and you had done these things that kind of offered the opportunity to use the grids in the context of the modular.
That's right. So we've been building grids now since a very long time. Yeah, it's like how many grids have I touched? And we're still weirdly doing it pretty much the same way with, just this morning before I called you, Kelly and I were just in the workshop putting circuit boards into pieces of metal and testing them and sticking them in boxes. So right. Yeah, we're still tiny house, but we like it that way. Yeah, 2014, we had just gotten into making the module. The first one was the white whale, and the idea to be able to connect it directly to the modular, have an application running on it, whereas kind of the premise of the grid to begin with was that you would plug it into a computer and it would do stuff, but it could basically do anything because, it would almost be upon you to write some software and decide what you wanted to do. But then a big community sprung up around it so everyone could actually share each other's work. And it kind of established the identity of Monome as being almost kind of collective of people all contributing different ideas and having a big dialogue. The modules were kind of a departure in a way because they represented these fixed ideas that I had kind of come up with that, were sort of these different grid gestures and this different visual language using the grid that then got concretely coded into these pieces of hardware, which was great because you didn't have to do any setup. You just plugged it in and it would go. But just to kind of make it more complicated, I guess, everything was then open sourced, and then pretty quickly people started modifying the firmwares and got a handful of really good ones, particularly by Scanner Darkly made some great alt firmwares. But writing a firmware for a module was never kind of a fun creative experience, honestly. Just doing embedded firmware requires a bunch of tool chain setup. It's all in C. It requires kind of some pretty specialized knowledge about memory management and this sort of stuff, which is not really the same as even stringing together some max patches to try to do something musical kind of quickly. So it remained kind of limited to a narrow group of people who were kind of hyped to get into this universe of working within the modular, but kind of with some of their own ideas. Right after we had done these three modules, the trilogy, which ended up being White Whale, Metaphysics, and Earthsea, which represented three kind of distinct different interaction methods with the grid. The big new project that we did, which got a kind of hilarious reception at the beginning because the proposition was to be able to plug a computer typing keyboard into the front of your module, which of course was the antithesis of
what people thought they wanted, right?
Yeah, the refrain is, I want to play my modular because my job is at my computer all day and I don't want to be touching my computer or something. Right. So this proposition was the opposite of that. But what the proposition really was the teletype has this really low fidelity screen on it. You can't fit a ton of characters on. And by plugging the keyboard into it, what you're actually able to type this like a series of commands, a really simple syntax to make it do stuff on the fly in real time. And so this is very different than, writing a firmware on your computer, flashing it up to the module and seeing it go. This was something that potentially more akin to playing, but also the possibility of writing these little scripts that you can store and then get assigned to incoming triggers, then created this platform where you could actually create really complex musical gestures just with these little tiny snippets that started to resemble a score. So this blending between composing with code sort of actually meaning something, where, of course it has meant things, since sound and the rest, but having people be able to tie it to, like, integrate it with their patch cables really, really quickly, and also have such a kind of absurdly simple syntax is like kind of like embarrassing when real computer scientists look at this thing. But you basically being able to type things like CV5, like voltage 5, and then that basically assigns a CV to a voltage, or to toggle a trigger to like tr.tog like 1. So
yeah, right.
flips. So this addressing the other issue with a lot of people talking about, well, they like really excited by the idea of programming, but man, that sounds really complicated. So kind of trying to remove all possible barriers that like you just cannot use that excuse anymore. It is simply not complicated.
Right.
Whereas, if you're just not interested in using text in your music, that's totally cool. But I think opening up the possibility to everybody has been really wonderful.
Well, I think what you did with the teletype, though, I think it actually extends beyond just sort of like the simplified and kind of minimalist syntax. There was other minimalism at play there as well. The base unit itself only really had one CV input, but it had 4 CV outputs and 4. So it really sort of spoke to generating things. It sort of steered away from the computer's almost like desire to take over your whole system, right? And instead you were like, we're going to kind of like tamp down on the amount of input, and let's use this as maybe a generator of stuff for the rest of your environment. But the other limitation I thought that was really interesting was the programs that you would write. They're limited to like 6 lines of code. So what it really was like is, and I just even mentioned that on a post recently, it's more like writing haiku than it is writing a novella, right?
Absolutely.
And as a result, that kind of retrains your focus on what you're going to attempt to accomplish and the means by which you're going to do it. To me, it's like a very refreshing thing, because like good minimalism at work, it changes your perspective and forces you to work in a maybe more innovative way.
And I'm glad that you frame it like that, because a lot of the intention with how to approach the unit absolutely had to do with that. The 6 lines is basically what would fit on the screen, and the idea of scrolling to me just suggested that it would become an incomprehensible system.
Right.
The chip, wasn't powerful enough to approach doing something like real-time audio processing. This is never going to be like a DSP platform. This was always going to be something that was taking event inputs and then likewise generating event outputs. And that for me, that's always been, my personal interest in terms of compositional territory. And I probably, as I said in the previous podcast, that basically everything we make just is me trying to fulfill some sort of like musical project that I then inevitably never get to, because then I move on to the next machine before ever achieving whatever collection of album or whatever. But someday, I still haven't actually resolved that since the last time we spoke. But yeah, maybe soon.
Maybe soon.
But one thing I wanted to talk about with the teletype, again, with the grid kind of spawned this enormous database full of mostly max patches, some super collider and PD patches as well. But then just the momentum of the community kind of used this database to just make permutations and kind of get kind of grow and grow. There's this fantastic momentum. I never really expected that teletype. Just because the scripts were so simple, they never were meant to kind of turn into standalone applications, these little snippets of code. But one thing that did happen was that, those handful of people that were interested in making custom firmwares suddenly got behind really expanding the syntax and kind of a lot of the user interface of teletype itself, even to the point to where OneLine's user, Sam, completely rewrote the entire code base, which it was based on, so that contribution could be a lot easier, and it was kind of more sane according to what good engineering is. And really since then it's kind of traded hands several times about with people leading different versions, and we're up to version 3 that just got released, where Scanner Darkly again got passionate about the idea of plugging a grid into the front of it, made all of these operators that you can basically program different interactions that you can then actually generate pretty well featured kind of grid interfaces, like directly through the teletype, using that as an interface, which totally blew my mind. Because at first when he proposed this stuff to me, I was like, do you really think that you can get that much, like I mean literally
into
you can only wedged into these 6 lines of code.
Yeah.
But just the way that he designed it, I mean, it's the passion is there and the design is exceptional, and just continually, this thing is just out of my hands at this point. It is such a collective effort that put forth this idea, but it's just really taken on a life of its own.
It's not only expansion on the software end, it's also on the hardware end too, where you had the TXI and someone else designed the TXI and the TXO, which are input and output expanders that greatly extend this thing, treating it almost like a platform.
Yeah, Brandon Cassidy. So there was this thing kind of just on a whim left the I2C connection. It's a digital communication bus on the back of, on the back side of it. When we were making the trilogy modules, thought like, well, maybe someday like that'll be useful for something. And by the time teletype came around, we realized like, oh, we can make little operators like these syntax commands to basically send data behind on the backplane and then control the other modules remotely, because they're all digital. So for example, like in the white whale, try to like control the playhead position or send a reset or this sort of thing, just conditionally with commands, which was super exciting. And but eventually that just started support for this I2C idea started cropping up everywhere. So Brendan made a bunch of expanders, so kind of more input and more output. He also was able to turn the output into kind of oscillators, so they actually could be sound sources directly tied into the environment. Trent added I2C control over Just Friends, the mannequins module, which essentially turned it into like a 6-voice polyphonic synth, which is it's totally wild. We got I2C added to talk to the orthogonal devices, the ER301. So now teletype control, a sampler all the way through. And there's been a handful more, and most of these I haven't even touched before. These have been code contributions by people that are just enthusiastic about open source and seeing that the power of this idea of having a real-time terminal that you can basically type into, it is actually kind of compatible with music making at the same time that you're also just patching and turning.
A lot of this kind of user collaboration also happens on, you're like turning into platform developer guy, right? Because if you think about it, the grids were kind of a platform for user expression, as were the ARC. You came up with the ELF, which was a platform for DSP development. The teletype, which has become this platform both for sort of like firmware development, as well as kind of this very syntactically compact performance platform development. But another platform that you actually were involved in creating was what we call the Lines community, which is like 8ls.cl, which I have been, every time people talk to me about like, hey, where do you spend time? My first place I tell them is like, go to the Lines community. It's a fabulous place to talk both music and art, and to do it in a way that seems not competitive, which is really rare in these kinds of communities.
I didn't realize that Lines, we hadn't established that last time we spoken, I guess.
Well, maybe it was, but it was kind of like
in early days.
It was the early days, so I think it was sort of like more of an extension of the monome.org site than it felt like a standalone community, right? I mean, at this point, it seems like it has a very specific life of its own.
Yeah. So the part of, I mean, just to speak quickly about where it came from. I mean, ever since we started making grids, the Mono forum has always been massively active, just because it was based on this idea of sharing. I mean, this idea that the grid actually didn't do anything by itself, so you had to get some programs, and the people that wrote the programs you were actually able to speak to directly and often hear back immediately, and there would be changes constantly. So it was a really dynamic, flowing kind of collaboration that was happening constantly, and that was a really exciting thing to be a part of. The one thing that I realized, that it was really focused so heavily on this idea of the grid that it wasn't very inclusive. So basically, people would get involved with grids. They'd be interested in grids for a while, and then they lose interest in grids, and then they'd feel kind of weird hanging around because everyone was still just basically
right.
I mean, even though we'd all kind of established these ties based on these explorations and being able to talk about me. So
you make it sound like that guy who finishes college but just can't seem to leave the college town.
Hopefully it wasn't that
Hopefully
weird.
It's better than that, right? Dude, why is he still hanging around the keg?
Yeah, he sold his grid 3 years ago. That's what I just realized, that having a platform and a community to speak about things that weren't just grids was what I really wanted. That it was clear that the Monome community forum was not just a kind of like company support forum. Basically,
Device, yeah, right.
It was a culture that had emerged really, really quickly. That was was brought together by a mutual interest, but it really extended much further. So the move to basically debrand the Monome community and make it not about Monome anymore was a complicated move, because we weren't sure. The we at the moment was Kelly, and this is when Trent was working for us as well.
Okay.
So trying to figure out how to have people want to join in with this same energy, but at the same time not basically have Monome itself just become, I don't know, like throw away Monome in a certain way.
Right.
So basically, when we decided to debrand the forum, we were trying to find a way to. This is funny, that realizing like my nervousness around trying to make broad generalizations about the forum is really clear. Like it only reinforces the fact that it is not mine in any way.
Right. Right.
And I think that is something that I can say with utmost sincerity. It's just like, while Monome still pays for the forum, we now have a big group of moderators and administrators who are super, super invested, and there is so much that goes on behind the scenes to kind of keep the ethos intact. And
right.
Moderation is not easy, and when you hands off any community for too long, it kind of will slide in any variety of different directions, which it's really easy to kind of break apart a culture really, really quickly.
Yeah.
So I'm really happy with the direction that it's gone. It seems to kind of constantly be widening the discussions that people are willing to have, and it has remained super, super civilized and encouraging. And we've had numerous moments where it seemed like maybe the house was going to burn down, and everyone survived and kind of made it through these
right.
moments. And
right.
kind of each time we emerge from what feels like a sort of crisis, it just reminds me that that this is a big collection of like really thoughtful humans that are really doing a good job.
Right. Now, one of the things that I think is hard for a lot of people is when they build something, it's really difficult to then just say, well, I'm going to release it to let it become whatever it is. You seem, if anything, to be almost shy of hanging on to things as long as you do. I mean, it seems like releasing things into the wild has always been your preference.
Yeah. I mean, I think that we always have the ability to kind of maintain our pet projects. And I mean, I can basically always keep my version and be maniacal about the decisions that I make in my own version. But I just love the idea that somebody else is going to have a totally different take on it, and that their ideas are very likely to come around and influence my own, to the point to where I stop even thinking about, sole ownership of certain projects that eventually just become a kind of big mass collaboration.
Like lines or like teletype at this point, I guess, right?
Yeah, and this is to say that, I still, as a designer and a musician, I still have very strong opinions about things being good or not, or being flexible. Like good is subjective, but right. I think staying flexible, or kind of certain issues around user interface and feature creep in particular. But there's just the fact that there is so much kind of willingness to get involved. I think it's always better to err on the side of permissivity.
Sure. Has that ever backfired on you? Do you ever feel like that went the wrong way for you?
I mean, in certain ways, like if I would have rather been a touring musician, I maybe should have kept all my software and just done that instead of, instead of like decided to go have my life be about building instruments. But in many ways, it's like, it's as satisfying to see a whole, group of people kind of exploring these in different ways, and then making music that is informed by some of the compositional or design ideas that I was really excited about myself. So in a way, the only thing that tends to backfire with giving too much stuff away is that you realize you actually have to maintain it. And there's a management, and there's like a long tail, basically.
Right.
It's like things don't necessarily go away. So there is almost a slight fear of wanting to kind of support and make sure people are having positive experiences with things that maybe I didn't put very much time into thinking how long they would live.
Sure.
Like, occasionally getting the strange email of some like weird Max patch I didn't even remember making that I then gave away. So,
right. Well, it's funny though too, because the way that you talk about, particularly some of the software efforts you've done, you talk about them as being like expressions or gestures rather than applications, which kind of make it seem like you think of them as being more ephemeral than they might actually be.
Well, for me, the idea is the interesting part. Re-implementing things is the nature of now. I mean, since basically anybody with enough effort can kind of learn how to do quite a bit when it comes down to technicality. I mean, when the idea of the grid, of the decoupled light and button thing, I mean, once the idea was there, basically anybody could go implement that. And so if in an application for a performance gesture, something like the shape memory on Earthsea, people don't need the code or the application. They just need to see the idea once, and then you can go implement that on any variety of platforms. And so
right.
In that sense, it's always the ideas that are more exciting. And I see the same thing happening in modular in a lot of ways. When there's an idea, it can be replicated, but the tricky part, particularly in the analog realm, is can they achieve, a particular sound? So on like a high design level, it's really for me, it's the ideas and the way which you relate to those ideas, how you interact.
Right. Now, speaking of like the reimplementation and that being the sense of the now, we have this new device that you've come out with, the Norns, which is, I've been playing with it now for a couple of weeks, and I am having so much fun. It's a wonderful little device. It's got a scripting language that is Lua with some extra libraries. It's got a back end, which is Super Collider with some way of getting of utilizing those engines inside of your Lua code and somehow even adding to them if you like. But it's an amazing little project, but again, it's kind of a lot different from everything else you've done. It's not like it's the LF 2.0. It's a very different machine from that. And
Absolutely.
it's also not like teletype plus plus. It's very much its own thing. What was your original design ideas behind it? And how did you make the choices that you did in implementing it?
I feel like Norns was a sort of culmination of a lot of design ideas that I've been having since the beginning for the sort of origin story. So Norns in old Norse mythology are like the female deities, the fates, Urther, Verdandi, and Skuld, the past, present, future, basically.
Okay.
So I liked this idea that the foundation of this object just goes all the way back to the original ideas I was having in the early 2000s, just about what it means to have like a minimalist control palette that was fundamentally designed to be redefined. I mean, calling it many sound instruments was sort of my solution to the language problem of like figuring out how to describe this thing. In fact, when we did the release, I feel like I had a crisis in trying to explain what it was because on the outside it's fundamentally the same thing as everything. It's a metal box that has some knobs and with sound input and sound output. But to me, it was such a deeply different idea than what what it typically means to release a new music electronic toy that sits on the desk like alongside the rest of yours. This was kind of this invitation to become invested in a different system of thinking. But when I did the release, I decided sort of impulsively that I was going to take a whole week where I was going to write a big post every single day to kind of slowly introduce the concepts and the background behind the thing. And I didn't realize that would actually kill all of my energy all day. Like each day I would just have to prepare for this post online, trying to explain to everybody what the goals were, what we were trying to do in this way that was compelling, and kind of also to ward off. I mean, I was really nervous about something that promises too much, but at the same time, something that just like there was a shiny video and people would just, immediately flash their credit cards at anything that's shiny. Really wanting to differentiate this as not like, this is not everything we've ever made, it's never been a sort of money grab product. If we wanted to actually like be wealthy on any stretch, we would not be pursuing almost any of these ideas. So, but more where the idea came from, it takes from the idea of what I said earlier, like a sort of minimalist control palette that's designed to be redefined. So I wrote that in front of me because that was one thing that somehow stuck. The same ways that the grid is designed to have an interaction created for it. There's nothing implicit about the arrangement of the buttons that suggests a certain way for it to be used. Mm-hmm. And so the Aleph in a lot of ways was that, in that it was just kind of a neutral box. But where the Aleph suffered was the kind of firmware flashing syndrome that I explained to you earlier, where you have to have a staggering amount of knowledge and kind of patience with a kind of clunky development process. Whereas the breakthrough with teletype was that you were working with code in real time, where you could type words at it and you'd get immediate feedback, which is just tremendously satisfying. So the Norns was trying to bridge all three of these ideas, which was an object that had objectness, that it was not a computer. I mean, it is a computer. Absolutely, it is a computer internally, but it was something that you could hold, you could treat like an instrument that was fundamentally redefinable and that you could interact with in a sort of real-time sense, that the prospect of creating your own instruments was not daunting and presented a huge learning curve.
So when you talk about the introduction of the Norns, I mean, you did these approaching videos also, which I thought were, on one hand, they were very prototypical of the way that you approach kind of your marketing material, which is like, I'm going to very quietly do a little performance and you're going to watch, and it might include one of my devices or it might not. But in any case, There you go. Hopefully you find something interesting, right? And I thought that they were very compelling. But one of the things that you did was you didn't really focus heavily on the programming part of it. That has subsequently come up with sort of the educational
studies.
The studies that you've put together, which that was something that you started with the teletype originally, was using these ways of basically saying, let's together work our way towards the development of one of these kind of gestural type programs. And you've continued that now with the Norns. Is there something about that, I mean, are you getting good feedback on that, or is it just the way that you prefer to think of education working?
Well, I think there has been good feedback, but also I know the experience of just being handed a reference manual, like that is not so I mean I knew with teletype that I was going to be fighting an uphill battle trying to convince people that this was a good idea. So by introducing, a handful of commands and then showing something like immediately semi-musical that you could do with it, to me was a way of capturing people's interest, but also having something kind of, quick and readable is such a better way. Also kind of dictating bite-sized pieces that are not going to be overwhelming. I mean, like, take a cue from the Max tutorials. I mean, Cycling has done an exceptional job in their kind of educational approach. So my impulse to create these sort of studies was highly informed by the Cycling 74 kind of tutorials, which were really instrumental in getting me to learn a bunch of things that may have been less compelled to do so if it was just a big reference manual.
Right, I see.
I'm still in the middle of making the Norns studies, and they will be more complete soon, but it's been good to kind of release a new batch so people can kind of catch up to where we're at.
Right.
But I'm also interested in kind of after this starting to do some sort of group programming studies where there will be, kind of like a goal laid out, and then collectively we can all kind of work through like a contributed set of ideas towards the end, sort of how, Mark runs this junto on lines, which is
right.
Gives everyone a prompt of something to do musically, and then everyone contributes their tracks and there's discussion around it. Different ways of kind of encouraging group activities where we can both, appreciate the process, but then also kind of arrive with a bunch of kind of creative output at the end.
Right.
So I'm hoping that's where the studies will evolve.
Yeah, so with the Norns, you made kind of an interesting choice to use Lua as the front-end scripting language. Was there a reason other than the fact that it's a relatively easy, embeddable language to use?
Just so it was more full-featured, and after the teletype, teletype is a handmade language. I mean, it's really simple, kind of postfix notation. It's, like a TI calculator or something,
right.
But it is all handmade, and I was just at the end of that, even though all of the contributors to the teletype code base did a great job, I still just long for something kind of more powerful that would have some library functions that you can kind of stretch out and have it be traditionally readable to kind of anybody that knows any of the normal languages like C or Python or JavaScript or anything like this, that it instantly becomes very, very familiar. And Lua is even more readable than those in a way that I feel can be inviting to newcomers. So yes, it was really just about a balance between the power and ease.
I think also one of the things I realized at first, I was like, I have to admit, my first thought was, why not use JavaScript? And then I realized, well, because then there's going to be this implication that you have to support everything that JavaScript could support. And the last thing you want to do is have like React Native freaking applications written on it, right? And then it's like, well, why not do Python? And then again, you have sort of like the support thing, but also there's this sense where if you pick one of those kind of established language, you're almost cutting out everyone else that uses a different language. Where if you pick something like Lua that has this history of being like scripting entry into a more complex environment, it sort of says, well, let's all compromise and use this as a gateway into doing what we want to accomplish. It seems like, in a way, it's a choice that prevents people from having a stiffened back reaction. Yeah,
I think so. It's it's really just a simple layer that helps you get at the things you want to do quickly without being too concerned about some of the more heated programming discussions that will be had.
Right.
And also, and also the decision, I examined quite a few options, and also at this time I was working with Ezra. So Ezra helped program the great majority of the backbone of the sub applications that are running inside of it, and he really prototyped kind of getting everything working to begin with while I was working on the hardware. What's amazing about the Norns is how it actually got developed was very, very different than anything I've ever worked on before, just based on the number of these community members that I'd already been in contact with.
Right.
For example, Greg, who wrote the entire MIDI part of the Ansible because that sounded interesting to him. Basically he was open to me sending him like a weird dev board that I had made that goes on top of a Raspberry Pi 3 to start poking around to this stuff that Ezra and I were working on. And eventually this expanded to, a handful of other people, Artem and Anton and Simon and Phil and several more, where I was basically able to, as I was progressively making closer and closer to final Norns hardware units, just sending them out to everybody. And before I knew it, we were all collaborating on a code base and getting very, very far on a thing that didn't even exist yet. And again, this was all basically just kind of open source in the spirit of enthusiasm for the ideas that this object could, unleash once it was ready. So this is something that really was jointly designed in a lot of ways after I kind of set forth what I thought the goals were. And that has been, and it continues to be like this. Individually, each of the contributors have really taken hold of, one part of the project that, they're passionate about and have continued to carry forward. And it would absolutely be a very different, much less polished device, or just many more years in the future still, if this kind of isn't how it came about. And I'm just so stunned and grateful about how the decision to make a bunch of our projects open source, a decade ago, then led to this, possibility of this forum, and then this
and
group
the
of
deep
people.
Collaborations,
yeah. This just does not feel like how normal things get made.
Right. That's really true. Well, and it's especially you bring up working with Ezra on this stuff. I mean, you have actually a very long history of working with him. Going back all the way to when I first met you. I met you and Ezra on the same day.
That's right. Yeah.
It's a collaboration that has existed for, much of your adult life. And so it's probably interesting to be able to have those kind of collaborations without it necessarily having to be wrapped up in some sort of like, business / whatever kind of organizational structure.
Absolutely. And it makes the projects hopefully more about the end goals of creating something that everyone is mutually interested in, want to use in their own musical process. And I feel this same way about the people who contribute on basically anybody who ever submits, a GitHub pull request. It's like they are trying to kind of help shape this to also help fulfill some sort of musical desire that they want. And I feel like that is a really fantastic motivator for collaboration.
Right. Well, crap. We're already like running out of time, and I've been scribbling down notes here, and I got a whole ton of stuff I'd love to talk more about, but I want to kind of focus these last few minutes on where you're going to go from here. So obviously the Norns has just come out. I think you've put out your third batch of them right now. Is that true?
Yeah, the third batch we had just finished putting together, and they're all going to be shipped out in the next day, basically. I mean, so much energy went into basically manufacturing optimization for this thing. I mean, part of the reason that we weren't able to continue with the Aleph was just because of so many manufacturing
issues
right. Yeah. that were also related to, my very ambitious design that I really was excited about. But I'm equally excited about the Norns, but it has backed behind it a whole bunch of experience of various kinds of industrial failure. So
yeah.
So now these are actually, we're capable of actually producing these, and I'm excited that we were able to not, have it cost over $1,000. So we're on track to be able to continue producing these and not have them become a rarefied device, which is fantastic. But in terms of the future, I feel like the Norns fundamentally as an object to be redefined. And part of what I mean by that is, there's not a keyboard attached to it, or there's not a grid attached to it. It's not fundamentally meant to be used in a particular way, but I'm excited myself just to start connecting new things to it and kind of exploring what many of the new uses are, which I haven't even had time to even think about, given that we're just trying to make this thing. One hole that is kind of left out with the Norns so far is its connectivity to any sort of modular stuff. And right now, Trent and I are just about wrapping up a little 2HP module, which will be kind of a USB device connectivity to the Norns, but also to kind of any USB host that will similarly be not like a USB sound card. That's super boring. It's actually akin to giving teletype like functionality to the Norns, so that you can kind of script these event level, CV
interactions. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. But also the chip is fast enough to do some analysis and do some synthesis as well. And also, run actually its own Lua interpreter on the actual board, which will be really interesting for this kind of like cluster code back and forth things, that sounds nebulous, and I will have to explain that more in the future. But it's
well, best to leave it nebulous until it ships, right?
Yeah, less promises, but it does promise to be really, really, really exciting. I think the pairing between the two will be wonderful. I mean, particularly because recently I've been more and more interested in the shrinking of my kind of Eurorack setup when getting to perform. Mm-hmm. Recently, Kelly and I got to do a really big show with our friend Jay. It was for a circus festival. It was massive. We filled up the whole rifle case again, but it was just, a couple of Norns and a keyboard and a microphone. Oh, but also what was in there is just like a 42 HP, like a really, really tiny little blob, mostly mannequins modules. Mm-hmm. And the ability to just explore a very, very tiny rack, I think is really, really satisfying to me, particularly when you can then do this sort of higher level compositional decision making with something like teletype, right, or like this idea of Norns connected to a little CV interface, where not just trying to have the Eurorack do everything that you can possibly think of, because that becomes really difficult on your budget, but being able to kind of use instruments for what they're best for and what they're potentially designed to be best for. So that's been really rich territory to explore recently.
Well, that sounds really exciting. I'm looking forward to continuing my exploration with the Norns, as well as trying out this little device. It sounds like a great addition, a great tiny addition too. Thanks for that. It seems like lately a lot of the modules coming out seem to want to be about the size of a skiff size module, so it's nice to have the idea of a small thing that can slot in and really give me some integration. I like the sound of that. But I just want to thank you for keeping on doing what you do. It's an encouragement to me to see not only that you're doing these things, but you're succeeding, and that the community is growing to support it as well. It's a fantastic thing. It certainly seems both organic, but also somehow like really healthy and really human in a great way, to see the things that you are doing succeeding in the world. So thanks so much for keeping on doing that, man.
Thank you so much. And likewise, your podcast is a source of continual optimism. So I appreciate that.
Okay. Well, I will try and not be too dour in the future then, now that I know that that's my responsibility.
It's all of our responsibility.
It's all of our response. There you go. And so with that, I'm gonna let you have the rest of your day. Thank you so much.
All right. See you, Darwin.
All right. Bye. Many thanks to Brian for spending the time and for having a chat. If you haven't had a chance to see a Norns in action, first off, check out the videos. Secondly, if you have a friend or get to see a demo somewhere, check it out, because it's a lot of fun. I've had a lot of fun playing with it, not only writing my own programs, but using the implementation of MLR on the thing and other applications written by other people. It's amazing stuff. You can check it out at monome.org if you want a little more information. I want to thank you, the listeners, for continuing to show up, passing this along to your friends, sending me great notes, and a lot of encouragement. I appreciate that. And if you have any questions, comments, or ideas for someone to interview, shoot me a line, ddg@cycling74.com, darwin.gross@gmail.com, ddg@20objects.com. All these things will get it to me. But with that, I'm going to let you go. Have a great one, and we'll catch you next time around. Bye.